The snow began to fall as night descended on Aspen, Colorado. Large, soft flakes drifted down in silence, like whispers from the sky, blanketing the landscape in a pristine white shroud. From a third-floor window of the Aspen Grand Lodge, Louis Freeman could see the majestic mountains blurring into the flurry, leaving only the warm, golden lights of ski chalets scattered across the hillsides. Tonight, the hotel glittered like a diamond against the winter sky, a beacon of opulence and power. It was the night of the Pinnacle Capital Group's annual Christmas party, the most anticipated event of the year, where the rigid rules of Wall Street temporarily gave way to champagne and frivolous socializing. Louis adjusted the knot of his Armani silk tie, feeling it tighten like an invisible noose around his throat. He glanced at his reflection in the grand gold-frame mirror of the ballroom. A 31-year-old man, his dark skin a stark contrast against the crisp white collar of his shirt. His eyes shadowed with a weariness he tried to mask with a professional smile. He was a success story, a rising star. Senior financial analyst, the only black man in such a position in a firm where power was measured in Anglo-Saxon names and Ivy League degrees. He knew he was a symbol, a token, living proof of the company's shallow diversity policy. The feeling was a cocktail of pride and a never-ending burden. He stepped into the ballroom, a world of dazzling contrasts. The warm glow from massive crystal chandeliers fought against the biting cold outside. The smooth, mellow sound of a live jazz band clashed with the cacophony of loud laughter and conversations about multi-million-dollar deals and upcoming trips to St. Bart's. The stark black suits of the managing directors stood beside the glittering, colorful evening gowns of their wives and girlfriends. And in the center of this organized chaos was Molina. His wife, as always, was the center of her own universe. She wore a form-fitting red dress, the color of Cabernet, that highlighted every perfect curve of her body. Her jet-black hair was swept up in an elaborate chignon, revealing a slender neck and the diamond earrings he'd given her for their anniversary. At 24, Molina was the embodiment of beauty and vitality. She stood in a circle of male colleagues from the marketing department, a glass of champagne in hand, her head thrown back in laughter at some unheard joke. Her smile was radiant, infectious, but to Louis, it looked like a meticulously calculated performance. 2 years ago, this beautiful woman, a rising star in her own right, had agreed to marry him. Sometimes Louis wondered if it was the smartest or the worst investment of his life. There he is, the champion! The familiar voice of Douglas Pierce pulled Louis from his thoughts. Douglas, his closest friend, and the only colleague Louis truly trusted, approached with 2 glasses of whiskey. "You're almost an hour late." "Sorry, had to finish the annual report," Louis said, accepting the glass and taking a sip. The amber liquid burned a familiar, welcome trail down his throat. "Anything exciting happening?" "The usual," Douglas shrugged. The big boss already gave his 3rd rambling speech. Johnson from accounting is wasted and showing everyone his stamp collection. "And your wife." Douglas paused, his expression turning uncharacteristically serious. He nodded his chin toward Molina. Louis followed his gaze. Molina was now talking to Benjamin Hayes, the new project manager transferred from the New York office. Benjamin was the pinnacle archetype, tall, blonde, with a confident smile, and a perfectly tailored suit. The problem wasn't that they were talking. The problem was how they were talking. Molina was leaning in, too close, so close her hair almost brushed his shoulder, and her hand with its long, red-painted fingers, rested casually on his forearm. A dangerously intimate gesture. A slow burn of jealousy and insecurity ignited in Louis's chest. This wasn't the first time. "She's just networking," Louis said, the phrase that had become his mantra for months, a weak attempt at self-reassurance. Douglas looked his friend straight in the eye, his gaze full of pity. "Louis," he whispered, his voice low and charged with a clear warning. "You need to watch your wife. That new project manager, Benjamin, doesn't look like he just wants to talk business with her." Douglas's words were a dagger, piercing the fragile shield of denial Louis had so carefully constructed. He looked back at his wife. At that exact moment, Molina felt her husband's eyes on her. She didn't flinch. Instead, she met his gaze, a defiant smirk flashing across her lips before she turned back, laughing even more brightly at Benjamin, as if she were deliberately trying to provoke him. The gilded cage he thought he lived in suddenly showed its cracks, and beneath the glamorous facade, he felt a cold, terrifying emptiness. The air in the ballroom suddenly felt suffocating. The smooth jazz now sounded like a mocking dirge. The cheerful chatter morphed into an irritating buzz, drilling into his eardrums. He needed to get out, if only for a few minutes. "I'll be right back," he told Douglas, setting his nearly empty whiskey glass on a nearby table. Douglas nodded, his eyes still filled with concern. Lewis navigated through the clustered groups of people. Their smiles and social greetings met with a mechanical nod. He felt their eyes on his back. What were they thinking? The lucky black guy who married the beautiful white trophy wife? Or were they whispering about what the entire firm seemed to know, except for him? The racism at Pinnacle wasn't overt slurs. It was more insidious, a subtle poison. It was in the feigned surprise when he delivered a brilliant analysis, in the patronizing way they called him Buddy, or in how they looked at him and Melina as an interesting and exotic couple. He pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped into the corridor leading to the secondary lobby. The relative silence was a relief. The frigid night air filled his lungs, clearing his head slightly. Outside, the snowstorm was intensifying. Snow lashed against the windows, a scratching, frantic sound, as if nature itself was in a rage. He leaned against the cool wall, closing his eyes, trying to push the image of Melina and Benjamin from his mind. But it kept returning, vivid and painful. That's when he heard it. A familiar voice, Melina's voice, drifting from a small guest lounge at the end of the hall. She was speaking softly, but in the corridor's silence, every word was distinct, sharp as a razor's edge. "He suspects nothing," Melina said, a hint of smugness in her tone. "Lewis is too absorbed in his charts and reports to notice anything else." Another female voice responded, and Lewis immediately recognized it as Catherine Morris, the HR specialist and Melina's best friend. "You're playing with fire, Mal. This is dangerous." "I know what I'm doing," Melina retorted, her voice hardening. "It's over between us. I'm just waiting for the right moment." Lewis felt his heart stop. His entire body went rigid. He wanted to leave, to run from this brutal truth, but his feet were cemented to the floor. He held his breath, listening. "The right moment? You mean after you get your year-end bonus?" Catherine asked, a touch of sarcasm in her voice. Melina let out a cynical laugh. "Of course. I'm not a fool. I've put in 2 years at this place, putting up with my boring husband. I deserve my cut." The words were like hammer blows to his chest. Boring husband. She saw their marriage as a sacrifice for financial gain. A cold void began to spread through him, replacing the initial sting of jealousy. But it was Catherine's next line that was the kill shot, the one that would change everything. "What about your diagnosis? Are you going to tell him?" A long pause followed. Lewis could hear the blood pounding in his ears. Diagnosis? Diagnosis of what? Cancer? Some kind of disorder? 1,000 terrifying possibilities flashed through his mind. Finally, Melina spoke, her voice as cold as ice, devoid of all emotion. "No, it would only complicate things. Besides, we haven't been intimate in months. I'm not even sure I infected him." Infected him. Those 2 words drilled into Lewis's psyche. Infection. This wasn't cancer. This was something transmissible. His entire world tilted on its axis. The disconnected pieces of the past few months began to click into place. Melina's aloofness, the sudden business trips, the whispered late-night phone calls, the fatigue and weight loss he had attributed to stress. "But he has a right to know, Mal." Catherine's voice grew urgent, tinged with outrage. "This is more than cheating. You've put his life at risk." "Enough!" Melina cut her off. "I've made my decision. I'm meeting Jay tomorrow. He promised to find me an apartment. It'll all be over soon." "Jay, the guy from the Vancouver conference?" "Yes," Melina laughed, a sound that Lewis could picture, cold and calculating. "It's grown into much more than that." Lewis couldn't listen anymore. He felt the ground crumbling beneath his feet. He hadn't just been betrayed. He might have been handed a death sentence by the very woman he had once sworn to love and protect. Rage, fear, and profound grief erupted inside him. A storm of emotion more violent than the blizzard raging outside. He had to confront her. Right now. The initial shock quickly gave way to a cold, focused rage. Lewis no longer felt pain or fear. only a searing fury that burned away all reason. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his voice, and stepped out from his hiding place. He strode down the corridor with long, determined steps. Melina and Catherine were sitting on a plush, plum-colored sofa, their heads close together in a conspiratorial whisper. When she saw Louis appear in the doorway, Melina flinched, her eyes widening in surprise. But she quickly composed herself, donning a mask of cool indifference. Catherine, on the other hand, went pale, her hands nervously smoothing her dress. "Louis," Melina said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "we were just talking about you." "I heard," Louis replied, his voice low and raw. "I heard enough." The tension in the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Catherine scrambled to her feet, her eyes avoiding Louis's. I think I should get back to the party," she stammered. "People will be looking for me." She squeezed past Louis and practically fled down the hall, leaving the husband and wife to face each other in a heavy silence. Once they were alone, Melina slowly rose. She squared her shoulders as if preparing for battle. "Eavesdropping isn't a good look on you, darling," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Louis ignored her provocation. He took another step forward, his eyes locked on hers, searching for any trace of the woman he once loved, but finding only a stranger. "What diagnosis? What the hell were you talking about?" Melina turned away, looking out the window where the snow was falling even more heavily. "Not here," she said, her voice commanding. "Let's go up to the conference room on the top floor. No one's there." They walked in silence, taking the grand staircase, avoiding the glass elevator where they might encounter other guests. Each step on the marble echoed in the quiet space, a countdown to an unavoidable confrontation. The top-floor conference room greeted them with a chilling cold and darkness. Melina flipped a switch, and the room was bathed in the dim, yellow light of wall sconces, casting long, eerie shadows. A massive mahogany table dominated the room, surrounded by luxurious leather chairs. This was where Louis had presented financial strategies that had made the company millions. Tonight, it was the arena for the collapse of his marriage. "So?" Louis crossed his arms over his chest, feeling the anger building to a breaking point. "Talk." Melina circled the table, keeping a safe distance from him. "I didn't want you to find out this way," she began, her tone suggesting she was the victim. "I had a different plan." "Find out what?" His voice trembled with rage. "That you're cheating on me with some guy named Jay? Or the mysterious diagnosis you didn't think you needed to tell me about?" "Both," she said, lifting her chin, her eyes filled with defiance. "I haven't been happy with you, Louis, not for a long time. We live like roommates, not a husband and wife. And that's why you decided to sleep with someone else instead of talking to me?" He took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "Talk?" she scoffed, a bitter, humorless laugh. "Talk about what? You live for your job. You come home to sleep and you're gone before the sun is up. When was the last time we had a real conversation? Or made love?" Louis opened his mouth to object, but the words caught in his throat. She was right. Their marriage had become a formality long ago. He had been so consumed with proving himself in a world that didn't welcome him that he had neglected the one person by his side. But that didn't excuse this cruel betrayal. "I was going to file for divorce after the new year," she continued, seeing his silence. "I wanted to do it civilly." "The diagnosis," Louis insisted, pushing aside all her excuses. "What was the diagnosis you were talking about with Catherine?" Melina turned away. A subtle shift occurred in her posture. Her shoulders slumped, her arrogance vanished, replaced by a fleeting vulnerability. "3 months ago," she said, her voice so quiet Louis could barely hear it. "I was diagnosed with HIV. HIV." The word hung in the cold air of the room, an invisible death sentence. Time seemed to stop. A hollow ringing filled Louis's head. "HIV," he repeated mechanically. "And you said nothing?" "I didn't know how." Her voice trembled. "First there was shock, then denial. I thought it was a mistake." "Who did you get it from?" Louis asked, though he already knew the answer. "Probably Jay," Melina said, meeting his gaze. We weren't always careful." Something inside Louis shattered. 2 years of marriage, the promises, the plans for the future. All of it had been a lie. "And what about me?" His voice was eerily calm. You put me at risk too. We've barely slept together in the last 6 months, she countered. But you knew, Lewis roared, the calm vanishing, replaced by an uncontrollable fury. You knew you were sick, and you still... He couldn't finish the sentence, disgust choking him. The argument escalated to its breaking point. Lewis lost all control. He lunged forward, his hands clamping down on Melina's shoulders, the force of his rage making his knuckles turn white. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he screamed in her face, shaking her. Her head snapped back helplessly. "How could you do this?" "Let go! You're hurting me!" Melina shrieked, struggling against his grip. But Lewis didn't seem to hear. Blood pounded in his ears. All he saw was the face of betrayal. In a moment of madness, he just wanted to erase that smug, deceitful look. She managed to break free, stumbling back, her eyes wide with fear. "You're insane." That moment, Lewis snapped back to reality. He looked at his hands, then at Melina. What had he done? He backed away, panting. "Get out," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Just get out. I don't want to see you again." Melina straightened up, the fear in her eyes quickly replaced by a seething hatred. She rubbed her shoulders, where his fingers had left red marks. "You know what?" she spat. "I'm glad it's all out in the open. Now I don't have to pretend anymore. You've always been a coward, Lewis, always afraid to really live. But me, I want to live, no matter the cost." She turned and stormed towards the door. But halfway there, she stopped and looked back at him, a malicious smile twisting her lips. "Oh, and I hope you're infected too. Then we'll be even." The door slammed shut, leaving Lewis alone in the cold room, her final words echoing in his head. He stood there, rage and pain swirling inside him, creating a maelstrom of uncontrollable emotion. Lewis had no idea how long he stood in that conference room. Time seemed to have stopped, melting into a chaotic blur of anger, grief, and disbelief. Melina's final words, "I hope you're infected too," cut deeper than any knife. It wasn't just betrayal, it was pure malice, a final stab intended to destroy him completely. He sank into a chair, burying his head in his hands, struggling to breathe. What now? His life, the career he had painstakingly built, the future he had dreamed of, all of it had turned to ash in a single night. Finally, after an eternity, a sliver of reason returned. He had to go back to the party. He couldn't let anyone see him like this. He had to maintain his composure, at least until morning. Tomorrow, he would get tested. Tomorrow, he would decide what to do next. He stood up on trembling legs and walked out of the conference room, leaving behind the chilling cold and the ghosts of his dead marriage. When he returned to the ballroom, the party was still in full swing. No one seemed to have noticed his absence. The music, the laughter, the clinking of glasses created a thick wall of sound that made him feel more isolated and alone than ever. He automatically nodded at a few acquaintances, but avoided all conversation, hugging the wall, trying to become invisible. He scanned the room for Melina, a part of him still hoping she had left the hotel, but he didn't see her anywhere. "Hey, you okay?" Douglas appeared at his side, handing him a glass of water. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine," Lewis lied, his voice dry and scratchy. "Just a headache. Have you seen Melina?" Douglas shook his head. "Not for the last half hour, maybe in the ladies' room." Just then, a terrifying, blood-curdling scream erupted from the service entrance at the far end of the hall. The scream tore through the festive atmosphere. The music abruptly stopped. The entire room fell into a dead, shocked silence, broken only by the echo of that scream. All eyes turned to the service door. A young hotel employee in uniform burst out, his face as white as a sheet, his eyes wide with horror. "Call an ambulance," he stammered, his voice cracking. "And the police. There's a woman in there. I think she's dead." A wave of panic swept through the room. Some people rushed toward the service door out of morbid curiosity, while others fumbled for their phones, their hands shaking as they dialed 911. Lewis stood frozen in the middle of the chaotic crowd, a terrible certainty slowly forming inside him. No, it can't be. Like a sleepwalker, he began to move, pushing through the murmuring crowd, heading toward that fateful doorway. He shoved aside the people blocking the entrance and stepped inside. It was a narrow, poorly lit corridor used for transporting supplies, smelling faintly of bleach and leftover food. At the far end of the hall, a small group of staff and guests were gathered, huddled over something on the floor. Lewis squeezed through them, and then he saw her. On the cold gray linoleum floor lay Molina. She was twisted in an unnatural, contorted position. Her red dress seemed even more vibrant against the bleak gray, like a spreading pool of blood. Her eyes were wide open, but they were empty, lifeless, staring blankly at the ceiling. And on her slender neck, where just hours before her diamond earrings had sparkled, there were now horrific deep purple bruises, the imprints of fingers dug deep into her flesh. Someone was screaming. Someone was sobbing. Lewis heard the sounds as if from a great distance, through a thick column of water. He looked at the body of the woman who had been his wife, and felt nothing. No grief, no fear. Just a deafening emptiness, a black hole that swallowed all emotion. It was no more than 15 minutes, though it felt like an eternity to Lewis, before the first police officers arrived. They quickly cordoned off the scene, pushing the curious onlookers back into the ballroom. An ambulance arrived soon after, but it was too late. The paramedics could only pronounce her dead. "Nobody leaves the building," a tall police officer ordered. "Everyone stays in the main hall until the situation is clarified." A middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a short, no-nonsense haircut appeared in the doorway of the corridor. She wasn't in uniform, just a long trench coat. She scanned the scene with a quick, razor-sharp gaze, then turned to the officer. "Detective Zora Addison," she introduced herself. "What do we have here?" "Female victim, approximately 25 years old. Apparent strangulation," the officer reported. "Found by a hotel employee at around 11:30. Time of death estimated to be within the last hour." Zora nodded, walked over to the body, and knelt beside it. She didn't immediately put on gloves, just observed. Her gaze swept over the victim's face, then the marks on her neck. Finally, she stopped at a broken fingernail and the scratches on the victim's wrists. "She fought back hard," Zora said, her voice thoughtful. "Find the man with scratches on his hands." She stood up, looking at the officer. "Who is she?" "Melina Freeman, an employee of Pinnacle Capital Group, the company hosting the party. Her husband, Lewis Freeman, is also at the party." Detective Zora Addison's gaze swept over the crowd being held in the ballroom. Her eyes, sharp and discerning, immediately found Lewis, the only black man standing frozen and lost in a sea of white faces. She looked straight at him, her expression not one of accusation, but of the cold, calculating focus of a predator who has found her first prey. "Isolate him in a separate room," she ordered, "and get me a list of all the guests. It's going to be a long night." The ticking of the clock on the wall was the only sound that broke the silence in the small hotel manager's office where Lewis was being held. The room was windowless, its four bland beige walls making the space feel even more claustrophobic. He sat motionless in a chair, his eyes fixed on an invisible point on the desk, his hands clasped in his lap. His crisp white shirt was now wrinkled, and the dark circles under his eyes betrayed a state of complete physical and emotional exhaustion. He wasn't thinking about Melina. He wasn't thinking about HIV. He just felt a profound numbness. The door opened and Detective Zora Addison entered. She placed a thin file on the desk and sat down across from him. "Mr. Freeman," she said, her voice professional but not unkind. "I'm Detective Zora Addison. I'm very sorry for your loss." Lewis looked up, his vacant eyes finally focusing. "You don't believe that?" His voice was a hoarse, raw whisper. "You think I killed Melina?" "Right now, I'm not thinking anything, Mr. Freeman," Zora replied calmly. "I'm gathering facts. Tell me about your conversation with your wife before she died." Lewis took a deep breath, gathering the shattered pieces of his memory. He decided to tell the truth, or at least part of it. I overheard her talking to her friend, Catherine. Melina admitted she was cheating on me with someone named Jay, and that she... He hesitated, his throat tightening. "She had HIV. She knew about it, and she kept it from me." Zora made a note in her pad, her face unreadable. "And how did you react?" "I was shocked, angry, of course. We went up to the conference room to talk privately. She confirmed everything there, said she was going to file for divorce after the holidays." "Was there a physical altercation between you?" Zora asked, her sharp eyes studying his reaction carefully. Lewis lowered his head, avoiding her gaze. "Yes. I grabbed her by the shoulders, probably harder than I should have. I was furious. He looked up, his eyes pleading. But I didn't kill her, I swear. I let her go and told her to leave. She left, and I stayed in the conference room. How long were you in there? I don't know exactly, maybe 20 minutes. Then I took the elevator back down to the party. Did anyone see you during that time? In the conference room or when you returned? I'm not sure. There was no one in the elevator, and when I got back to the ballroom, I just stood in a corner by myself. I didn't want to talk to anyone. Zora made another note. Your friend Douglas Pierce says he was with you from about 10:30 until the body was discovered. Is that correct? Lewis frowned, trying to recall. No, I mean, he came over to me when I first got back to the hall, gave me a glass of water, but we weren't together the whole time. I was alone for most of it. A critical contradiction. Zora showed no surprise, but a red flag went up in her mind. Lewis said he was alone. Douglas insisted they were together. Why was Douglas lying? Was he trying to create an alibi for his friend, an impulsive act of loyalty? Or was he hiding something else, something far more complex? Are you aware of any other men your wife might have been involved with, besides this Jay? Zora continued, her tone unchanged. No, Lewis shook his head. But after what I learned tonight, it could have been anyone. She flirted with everyone. And that made you angry? Of course it did, he said, bitterness creeping into his voice. What husband likes to see his wife flaunting herself with other men right in front of him? Angry enough to kill her? Zora asked flatly, the question landing like a punch to the gut. Lewis's head snapped up, indignation flaring in his tired eyes. I did not kill Molina, he said, his voice clear and firm. I was angry, yes, but I wasn't that out of control. Zora studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Freeman. Please remain at the hotel for now. I may have more questions for you. After Lewis was escorted back to a waiting room, Zora headed to the ballroom, where her assistants were still interviewing witnesses. Next on her list was Douglas Pierce. He was standing in a corner, looking anxious, nervously fiddling with his tie. When he saw Zora, he straightened up. Mr. Pierce? Zora gestured to an empty table. Can we talk? Douglas nodded, following her. You're a close friend of Lewis Freeman, correct? Zora began. Yes, we've worked together for 5 years. I consider him my best friend. And you claim you were with him at the time of the murder? Douglas nodded confidently. That's right, from about 10:30 on. He looked shaken when he came back to the hall, so I went over, gave him some water, and we stood in the corner talking about work until it happened. That's strange, Zora said thoughtfully, because that's not what Lewis says. He claims you came over briefly, but that he was alone most of the time. Douglas blinked, his confidence wavering for a fraction of a second. He must be misremembering because of the shock. We were definitely together. And what did you talk about? An upcoming project? The quarterly report? In the middle of a party, right after Lewis had a massive fight with his wife? Zora raised an eyebrow. Douglas swallowed hard. He didn't want to discuss personal matters. Work has always been his distraction. The explanation sounded plausible, but forced. What can you tell me about Lewis and Molina's marriage? Zora shifted gears. Douglas paused as if choosing his words carefully. They were different people. Lewis is serious, responsible. Molina liked fun, attention. Lately, there was obvious tension between them. Was Molina cheating on her husband? I can't say for sure, Douglas answered quickly, perhaps too quickly. But she wasn't opposed to flirting. With you? Douglas flinched as if struck. What? No, never. I respected their marriage. Zora made a note. Douglas's lie wasn't just a minor inconsistency. It was a major crack in the story. He wasn't just protecting his friend. He was building a wall, a barrier between her investigation and a truth he desperately wanted to keep hidden. But every wall has a weak point, and Zora knew that if she could just find the right pressure point, she could bring the entire deceptive structure crashing down. It was nearly dawn. Outside, the snowstorm showed no signs of letting up, blanketing Aspen in an eerie, muffled silence. Inside the Aspen Grand Lodge, the silence was even heavier. Most of the guests had been allowed to return to their rooms, but were forbidden to leave the hotel. The police presence was still heavy, and the festive atmosphere had completely evaporated, replaced by suspicion and fear. Detective Zora Addison sat in the makeshift command center, her eyes glued to a laptop screen, reviewing every frame of the security footage her tech team had just extracted. The hotel's camera system was old, covering only the main entrances, the lobby, and a few corridors. There were numerous blind spots, empty spaces where anything could have happened. Zora replayed the footage from the third-floor hallway. At 10:20 p.m., the camera caught Lewis and Melina heading up the main staircase. Lewis's face was tense, while Melina looked angry. They disappeared around the bend leading to the conference rooms. A long pause in the action. At 10:43 p.m., Lewis reappeared, but this time he was alone. He entered the glass elevator, and the close-up camera captured his face clearly. Pale, his hands trembling slightly, his gaze unfocused. He looked like a man who had just endured a profound shock. The elevator descended, and seconds later, another camera in the main lobby showed him exiting, walking toward the ballroom, and then disappearing from view. His statement about taking the elevator down alone was true. Zora kept watching. She switched to other cameras, searching for any sign of Melina. Nothing. No footage of her taking the elevator. No footage of her on the main staircase. It was as if she had vanished into thin air after Lewis left. But Zora was a veteran detective. She knew people didn't just vanish. There had to be another way out. She requested the hotel's full floor plan and found it. A service staircase at the far end of the third-floor corridor, right near the conference rooms. Unfortunately, that exit was in a complete blind spot. Zora returned to the main lobby footage. This time, she wasn't looking for Lewis. She was looking for Douglas Pierce, and she found him. At 10:45 p.m., just 2 minutes after Lewis took the elevator down, Douglas Pierce crossed the main lobby. He wasn't heading to the bar or the restrooms. He was walking quickly, almost furtively, toward the main staircase leading to the upper floors. The same staircase Lewis and Melina had taken earlier. Zora held her breath. Douglas's claim that he was with Lewis since 10:30 was a blatant lie. She continued to fast forward. 10:50, 11 so. At 11:05 p.m., Douglas reappeared at the bottom of the staircase, re-entering the main lobby. He adjusted his tie, glanced around nervously, and then headed toward the ballroom, where he would later find Lewis. He had been gone for exactly 20 minutes, the most critical 20 minutes of the night. The 20 minutes during which, according to the medical examiner, Melina Freeman was murdered. Zora's heart beat faster. What was Douglas doing up there? Was he looking for Lewis, or was he looking for Melina? She turned to another monitor, where an assistant was reviewing footage from an old, low-quality security camera, tucked away near the service area entrance. This camera wasn't connected to the main system, and had almost been overlooked. "Stop!" Zora commanded suddenly. The assistant jumped, rewinding a few seconds. On the grainy screen, a figure appeared. A figure in a red dress. At 10:50 p.m., Melina Freeman was seen coming down the employee service stairs. She paused at the bottom, looking around fearfully, as if worried she was being followed. Then she quickly stepped into the service corridor, the same corridor where her body would later be found. It was the last image of her alive. Things were becoming clearer, but also more complicated. The narrative was no longer a simple case of a jealous husband. Lewis went down at 10:43. Douglas went up at 10:45. Melina came down the service stairs at 10:50. This meant that when Douglas went upstairs, Melina was still alive and on the third floor, likely in the conference room. Did Douglas confront Melina there? Did they argue? And did that argument escalate to murder? Zora closed her eyes, piecing together the timeline. Lewis had the strongest motive, betrayal and the threat of HIV. But he had a weak alibi of having gone downstairs first. Douglas, on the other hand, had lied about his whereabouts and was on the scene at the exact time of the murder. But what was his motive? To protect his best friend? Or was there a deeper reason? "Detective!" A young officer poked his head into the room. "Catherine Morris wants to speak with you. She says it's urgent." Zora raised an eyebrow. Catherine, the best friend who had fled the scene when Lewis appeared. Perhaps she knew more than she was letting on. Catherine was waiting in a small break room, her eyes red from crying, her hands twisting a napkin. "Ms. Morris," Zora sat across from her. You wanted to see me? I have to tell you something, Catherine whispered, her voice trembling. About Melina. I'm listening. We were best friends. She told me a lot of secrets. I knew about her diagnosis. I knew about the cheating. And about Jay. Why didn't she leave Lewis sooner? Catherine looked down. The bonus. The January bonus. She wanted the money before she left. Melina was always a planner. Zora nodded. This matched what Lewis had overheard. What happened after I left you and Lewis to talk? Where did you go? Back to the party, Catherine answered quickly. I had champagne with my colleagues from HR. For the rest of the evening? Yes, she averted her gaze. I mean, I went to the ladies' room for a bit, about 10 minutes. At what time? I don't remember exactly, maybe around 11, Spaß. Zora made a note. Another person in the critical area at the critical time. One last question, Zora said, looking directly into Catherine's eyes. Did you ever see Melina alone with Douglas Pierce? Catherine flinched, her eyes widening. No, of course not. Douglas is Lewis's best friend. He would never... She hesitated, a flicker of doubt in her eyes. It's just... Sometimes I felt like Douglas watched Melina in a strange way. Not like a friend watching his friend's wife. More like a jealous lover? Zora finished for her. I don't want to accuse anyone, Catherine said hastily. It was just a feeling I got. After Catherine left, Zora returned to the command center. She looked at the whiteboard where her assistants had pinned photos of the key players. Lewis, Douglas, Catherine, a triangle, or perhaps a quadrangle, of complex relationships and lies. She felt like she was standing before a giant spider web. Every strand was a lie, and at the center of that web was a dark, deadly secret. And she knew, to unravel this web, she had to find the spider. The aspen dawn was a bleak, washed-out gray. The faint light of the new day struggled to pierce the thick blanket of snow clouds. Detective Zora Addison parked her unmarked police cruiser in front of the Freeman residence. It was a modern house, its architecture minimalist, with large glass panels and dark cedar wood, looking utterly out of place among the neighboring Swiss-style chalets. Its sterile neatness spoke volumes. Police officers were already finishing their search. Anything interesting? Zora asked the officer in charge. Nothing obvious, detective, he shrugged. The husband's office is obsessively organized. In the bedroom, we found 2 separate sets of bedding. Looks like they've been sleeping apart for a while. In the bathroom, 2 different toothbrushes at opposite ends of the counter. This marriage was clearly on the rocks. It was a picture of distance, of 2 people living under one roof but existing in separate worlds. Zora nodded. What about the victim's personal effects? In the walk-in closet, lots of expensive clothes, jewelry, handbags, and this. The officer handed her a small box, sealed in a clear evidence bag. Found it under a stack of sweaters in her closet. The box was made of lacquered wood, delicately inlaid with mother of pearl. It was unlocked. Zora carefully opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was a small leather-bound notebook in a deep crimson color and several USB flash drives. A diary. Bingo, Zora whispered. She put on a pair of gloves and carefully removed the notebook. What's the date of the last entry? 2 days ago, detective. Zora flipped to the last page and began to read. Melina's handwriting was flamboyant and forceful, revealing a personality full of emotion and determination. December 18th. He's starting to suspect something. Lewis asked me yesterday why I got home from work so late. I had to make up a story about an urgent project. I don't think he bought it. Jay says we need to accelerate our plans, but I can't leave until I get that damn bonus. And now, this diagnosis. The doctor says I can live with the meds, but who wants a woman with HIV? Jay stopped answering my calls as soon as I told him. Fucking coward. And Douglas. Another coward. He's the only one who stood by me, even though we agreed we'd never see each other again. Too dangerous, too close to Lewis. But he promised to help if the truth came out. Tomorrow is the corporate party. Then the holidays, the perfect time to wrap things up. A jolt went through Zora. Douglas, the name again. Not just a concerned friend, not just a secret admirer. Their relationship was much deeper. She flipped back a few pages. The entries became more explicit. Melina had detailed her affairs, first with a few colleagues from the office, then with Jay from the Vancouver conference. But it was the name Douglas Pierce that occupied the most space in the diary. October 20th. I never thought my husband's best friend could be such a passionate lover. It started as a game, a way to get back at Lewis for his eternal coldness. But now I can't stop. Douglas is obsessed with me. He says he's wanted me from day one. Sometimes I think he hates Lewis because I chose him, not him. Zora kept flipping. An entry dated September 14th made her hold her breath. Told Douglas about the diagnosis today. I thought he'd be furious, accuse me of being irresponsible. But he remained calm, an almost frightening calm. He said it didn't change anything, that we were now bound together forever. His reaction scares me more than the diagnosis itself. Bound together, forever. Frighteningly calm. Zora snapped the diary shut. A complete, twisted, and sick picture was beginning to form. Douglas wasn't just lying to protect his friend. He was protecting himself. He was an integral part of this tragedy. His motive wasn't loyalty, but obsession, jealousy, and perhaps fear. Fear of exposure. Fear of being bound to Melina by a deadly secret. "Bag the box and the flash drives as evidence," she ordered the officer. "Analyze the contents of those drives immediately." She slipped the diary into her coat pocket. This was her trump card. "And find me Douglas Pierce, now. He's no longer a witness. He's my prime suspect." An hour later, Douglas Pierce sat across from Zora in an interrogation room at the Aspen police station. His self-confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by an unconcealable anxiety and panic. His face was ashen, his trembling hands resting on the table. "Mr. Pierce." Zora placed Melina's diary on the table between them. "Are you familiar with this?" Douglas glanced at the red leather notebook and quickly looked away, as if it were a venomous snake. "No. What is it?" "Melina Freeman's diary," Zora said, her voice even. "A very candid diary." She opened it to a bookmarked page. "It details your relationship and the fact that you knew about her diagnosis." Douglas went pale. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead. "That's not true," he whispered. She made it all up." "Come on, Douglas." Zora leaned forward, her voice becoming sharp. "The cameras show you went upstairs right after Lewis came down. You were there when they were fighting. You heard Melina confess to her husband about the cheating and the sickness." "I didn't kill her." Douglas's voice cracked, trembling. "I swear, I didn't want her to die. But you lied about your whereabouts, lied about being with Lewis. Why?" Douglas buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. The wall of lies he had so carefully constructed had crumbled. Zora knew that behind that rubble, the truth was waiting, a truth that might be even more horrific than what the diary had revealed. He wasn't just a secret lover. What was his role on that fateful night? Was he an accomplice, the mastermind, or just another pawn in Melina's deadly game? Douglas looked up, his face a mask of fear and desperation. I was just trying to protect him," he stammered, his voice barely audible. "When I got up there, they had already argued. I heard the shouting from the conference room. I heard her confess everything. The affair, the sickness. Then Lewis came out. He looked like he was in a trance. I hid around the corner. He didn't see me." "And then?" Zora pressed, giving him no time to invent another lie. I went into the conference room. Melina was there. She was crying. She said it was all over, that Lewis knew the truth." "The truth about you two?" Zora asked directly. Douglas shook his head frantically. "No, she hadn't had time to tell him about me. Only about the guy Jay from Vancouver and the diagnosis." "And what happened next?" "We argued," Douglas said, looking down at the table, avoiding Zora's gaze. "I told her she had ruined my best friend's life, that she was a selfish monster who only thought of herself. She laughed in my face, told me I was no better, that she had just used me to get back at Lewis. Those words, Zora thought, must have been a dagger to his ego. He, who thought he was the special secret lover, was just another tool." "And that made you angry?" "No, I mean, yes, I was angry, but not enough to—" He stammered, unable to finish. "To strangle her?" Zora finished for him. "We found skin particles under Melina's fingernails. When the DNA results come back, we'll know if it's your skin, Douglas." Douglas looked up at her, a look of sheer terror on his face. "I didn't kill her," he repeated, like a desperate mantra. "Yes, we fought. Yes, I grabbed her by the shoulders, I shook her. But when I left, she was alive. She said she would go down the other way so she wouldn't run into Lewis." "Down the service stairs?" "Yes," Douglas nodded. "She used them often for our meetings." Zora studied Douglas's face intently. His story this time sounded genuine. It fit the timeline from the security cameras. If he was telling the truth, and Melina had gone down the service stairs after arguing with him, then the murder must have happened in a very narrow window of time, somewhere in that service corridor, at the hands of a third person. But who? "Detective, we have new information." An officer opened the interrogation room door and handed Zora a folder. Zora quickly scanned the contents. The tech team had analyzed the USB drives found in Melina's box. Most were work files and photos, but on one, there was a password-protected folder. They had cracked it. Inside were not photos or documents. They were audio files, recordings of Melina's phone conversations. Zora put on an earpiece and played the most recent file. Melina's voice came through clear and sharp. "I can't wait any longer, Catherine. I have to get out of here." Then Catherine's voice. "What about Lewis? What about Douglas?" "Lewis will find out soon enough. As for Douglas, he's a problem. He's becoming obsessive. He thinks this disease will bind me to him forever, the fool. I've recorded a few of our conversations, just as an insurance policy. If he gives me any trouble, I'll let Lewis know just how his best friend has been screwing his wife." Zora took off the earpiece. Melina had an insurance policy. Leverage against Douglas. This strengthened his motive to silence her, but his testimony was still compelling. Just then, Zora's phone rang. It was her assistant at the hotel. "Detective, we re-interviewed some of the staff. A waiter says he saw Catherine Morris not in the ladies' room, but slipping out the back door near the service corridor around 10:55 p.m. He said she looked very rushed and stressed. The dragnet was closing in. Catherine, the loyal best friend, she had lied. Not just once." Zora turned to the officer. "Douglas Pierce is free to go, for now. But don't let him leave town. Now, bring me Catherine Morris, immediately." Catherine was found at her apartment. She was packing a suitcase as if about to leave in a hurry. When brought to the station, her demeanor was no longer the grief of a bereaved friend, but the panic of a cornered animal. "Ms. Morris," Zora began, without preamble, "your story has holes in it. Security cameras, witness statements, they all show you lied. I want the truth, now. Where were you between 10:45 and 11:10 last night?" Catherine was silent, her lips pressed tight, her hands twisting the strap of her purse. Tears began to well in her eyes. "You were in the service corridor, weren't you?" Zora pressed on. "You were there when Melina was killed." Catherine broke down into hysterical sobs, her shoulders shaking. I didn't mean to." "Talk!" Zora slammed her hand on the table, the sharp sound echoing in the room. "I saw him!" Catherine shrieked through her tears. "I saw Lewis!" Zora was stunned. "Lewis? Where? When?" "In the service corridor, around 11 o'clock. He was coming out of there, and his hands—" She hesitated, her face contorted in fear. "There was blood on his hands. He was wiping it off with a handkerchief. Then he saw me. He looked at me with this look, like a warning that if I talked, I'd be next. I was so scared." "So why were you packing a suitcase when we arrived?" "I was afraid he'd find out I saw him. I was going to my sister's in Toronto." Catherine's testimony was a bombshell, a twist that upended the entire case. If she was telling the truth, then Lewis had lied. He hadn't stayed in the ballroom. He had gone back to the scene. But where was the proof? The word of a panicked witness wasn't enough. "The handkerchief," Zora pressed. "What did he do with it?" Catherine sniffled. I saw him go out the back door and throw it out into the snowstorm." A flicker of hope ignited, then died. The only piece of hard evidence, the key that could convict the killer, was gone, lost in the whiteout outside. Catherine Morris's testimony was a slow detonating bomb. It pointed directly at Lewis, but was based on a piece of physical evidence that had vanished. The blood-stained handkerchief, the potential key to the entire case, was now buried somewhere beneath the heavy, unrelenting snow of the continuing storm. For any prosecutor, this was a nightmare. The testimony of a single panicked witness, who had also lied previously, would be easily torn apart by Lewis's defense attorney in court. Zora stood at the command center window, staring out at the whiteout. She was in a race against time. Every falling snowflake was another layer obscuring the truth. She needed something solid, something irrefutable. "We can't count on finding it," a young officer said, his voice tinged with defeat. "This storm could last all day. By then, the scene outside will be completely compromised." Zora turned around. "Who said we'd be searching with our eyes?" She picked up her phone. "Get me Pitkin County K-9 unit. I need a search specialist, the best they've got." An hour later, a county sheriff's SUV plowed through the storm and skidded to a halt in front of the hotel. An officer in heavy winter gear stepped out, followed by a magnificent, majestic creature. It was Shadow, a German Shepherd K-9, his coat a deep black with a few dark brown markings, his eyes intelligent and alert. Shadow was a legend in the region, famous for his ability to find narcotics, explosives, and even missing persons in the most extreme conditions. Zora met Officer Miller, Shadow's handler, at the back door of the hotel, the very spot where Catherine claimed to have seen Lewis toss the handkerchief. "The search area is wide and the snow is deep," Zora said, her concern evident in her voice. "The odds are not in our favor." "Don't underestimate Shadow, Detective," Miller said with a confident smile. "The dog's got the devil's nose." They needed an article of Lewis's clothing for Shadow to get the scent. Zora had an officer retrieve the suit jacket Lewis had worn the night before from his room. Miller let Shadow sniff the jacket several times. "Find it, Shadow! Find it!" The dog let out an excited bark and went to work. He began to search systematically, his nose nearly brushing the fresh layer of snow. He moved in a zigzag pattern, covering the area near the back door, then expanding out into the hotel's garden. Zora, Miller, and a few other officers followed in silence, careful not to disturb the scene. The wind howled, whipping icy flakes against their faces. The cold was bone-chilling, but no one noticed. All eyes were on the black dog moving deftly through the white landscape. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes passed. Shadow was still searching patiently, but with no result. Zora's hope began to wane. Maybe Catherine had been mistaken. Maybe she had invented the story to get back at Lewis, or to divert the investigation from someone else. Suddenly, Shadow stopped. He stood frozen in the middle of an open courtyard, his head high, his nostrils flaring. He was catching a scent on the wind. Then, like an arrow released from a bow, he shot off towards a large snowdrift near the hotel's fence line, about 20 yards from where they stood. "He's got something," Miller shouted over the wind. They all ran after him. When they arrived, Shadow was digging frantically, sending snow flying in all directions with his front paws. His excitement was palpable. He knew he was close. Zora felt her heart pounding in her chest. This was it, the decisive moment. A few seconds later, Shadow stopped digging and carefully pulled something out from deep beneath the snow with his mouth. It was a crumpled white object, dotted with dirt. And against the white background, there was a dark red stain, the stain of blood. Miller carefully took the object with a pair of forceps and placed it in an evidence bag. It was a high-quality linen handkerchief, the kind a successful financial analyst would use. Zora looked at the handkerchief, then back at the hotel. She could picture the scene. Lewis, panicking after the murder, running outside, throwing away the only evidence, hoping the blizzard would hide his crime forever. But he hadn't counted on a silent, more persistent adversary. He hadn't counted on Shadow. "Get this to the lab now," Zora commanded, her voice now firm and full of authority. "Top priority. I want DNA and blood type analysis within a few hours." She turned back to Officer Miller and gently patted Shadow's head. The dog looked up at her, his tail wagging slightly. "Good boy," Zora whispered. "You just broke a murder case." The dragnet had closed. There was no more room for doubt or denial. Science would not lie, and the scent of truth, no matter how deeply buried, had finally been found. It was time to confront the killer. The silence in the interrogation room was even heavier this time. Lewis Freeman sat there, but he was no longer the exhausted and confused man from the first interview. There was a resignation in his eyes, the quiet stillness of a man who knows the game is over. Detective Zora Addison walked in, followed by an officer. She didn't sit down immediately. She walked right up to Lewis and placed a clear evidence bag on the table. Inside was the linen handkerchief, the dark red blood stain stark against the white fabric. "We found this in the courtyard, Mr. Freeman," Zora said, her voice even. "Buried under 3 feet of snow. A lucky find, wouldn't you say?" Lewis stared at the handkerchief. He said nothing. "Our lab technicians work fast," Zora continued. "The blood on this handkerchief is a match for your wife's, Melina Freeman. And preliminary DNA analysis shows the skin cells found on it are yours." She paused, letting her words sink in. "We also have the results from the skin particles found under your wife's fingernails. They're yours too, Lewis. She scratched you when you attacked her. Would you care to explain the marks on the back of your hand?" Lewis slowly raised his hand, looking at the faint red lines that, in his panic, he hadn't even noticed. He took a deep, shuddering breath, then exhaled slowly, as if releasing an immense weight. "She was telling the truth," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Catherine, she saw me." "Yes, she did," Zora confirmed. "And now I want to hear the story from you, not the lie about taking the elevator and staying in the ballroom. I want the truth. What happened after you left that conference room?" Lewis closed his eyes. The images of the previous night returned, vivid and agonizing. When he spoke, his voice was flat, almost emotionless, as if he were recounting someone else's story. "When I went downstairs after the fight, I couldn't think. My mind was blank. All I could think about was that she knew she was sick, and she still put me at risk. It wasn't just betrayal. It was attempted murder. She wanted to destroy me." He looked up, his eyes welling with tears. "I couldn't just let her walk away. I had to confront her again, make her explain." "And that's why you took the service stairs?" "Yes," he nodded. "I knew she used that route often. I wanted to intercept her, and I met her there, in the corridor. She was coming down. We came face to face." "What happened next?" Zora asked softly, her gaze still sharp. The bitterness returned to Lewis's voice. "She laughed in my face, said I deserved it, that she had never loved me, that she only used me to advance her career, that she'd been cheating on me since the beginning of our marriage with dozens of men." Lewis clenched his hands into fists, his knuckles turning white. "And with Douglas, too. She told me that she'd been sleeping with my best friend. It was the final straw, the ultimate, cruelest betrayal. I lost control," Lewis said, his voice breaking. "I grabbed her by the throat. I just wanted her to shut up, to stop saying those things. And then I saw the fear in her eyes, and it gave me strength. I squeezed and squeezed until she stopped struggling." He stared into the empty space before him, his eyes vacant. "Then I realized what I'd done. I let her go. She fell to the floor. I tried to find a pulse, but there was nothing. I killed her. I killed my wife." A profound silence filled the room. The confession had been made. "Did you try to cover your tracks?" Zora asked. "I don't know," he shook his head. "I panicked. I wiped my hands with the handkerchief, threw it away. I went back to the party, tried to act normal. I thought they'd find her later, maybe in the morning. I didn't expect it to happen so soon." Zora closed the file. She looked at Lewis, not with the eyes of a detective looking at a criminal, but as one human being looking at a tragedy. "Lewis Freeman," she said, her tone formal. "You are under arrest for the murder in the first degree of Melina Freeman. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." Lewis listened to his Miranda rights with a detached air. When the officer moved to handcuff him, he offered no resistance. He slowly stood up. "I got a double sentence, didn't I?" he said quietly, almost to himself. "HIV and life in prison. Maybe that's for the best." Zora stopped at the door. There was one last thing she had to say. One final cruel truth in a night full of them. "Mr. Freeman," she said, a hint of compassion in her voice. "The medical report came in from the hospital this morning. We asked them to run a more accurate confirmatory test." She took a breath. "Your initial HIV test, it was a false positive, an incorrect result. You're perfectly healthy." Lewis froze, the handcuffs half-clasped on his wrist. He turned to look at Zora, his face contorting with an unnameable emotion. It was shock, disbelief, and the deepest, most profound agony. Everything he had done, the rage that had consumed his life, had all been built on a lie. Then why did she say? He couldn't finish the question. Maybe she didn't know for sure, Zora answered. Or maybe she just wanted to hurt you. We'll never know for sure. As Lewis was led away, Zora stood alone in the interrogation room. She looked at the blood-stained handkerchief on the table, a crime of passion, ignited by a web of lies and betrayal. One life ended, another destroyed, all because of words. When Zora Addison walked out of the interrogation room, Douglas Pierce was waiting in the hallway. He looked like he had aged a decade overnight. His polished veneer was gone, leaving only a man with slumped shoulders and hollow eyes. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Lewis, he confessed?" "Yes," Zora nodded. "He met her in the service corridor, killed her in a fit of rage." Did she tell him about me?" The fear in Douglas's eyes was palpable. He wasn't afraid for Lewis. He was afraid for himself, for his reputation and his career. "Yes," Zora replied, without a shred of sympathy. In her final moments, she confessed everything. About all her lovers, including you. Douglas lowered his head, a soft moan escaping his lips. "I should have known." She could never keep a secret, especially if revealing it could hurt someone. "You're free to go, Mr. Pierce," Zora said, her voice cold. "The case is closed, but I suggest you rethink your priorities in life." She walked away, leaving Douglas alone with his shame and the wreckage of his life. In the days that followed, the story of the murder at the Aspen Grand Lodge faded from the headlines, replaced by other news. But its aftershocks remained. Lewis Freeman, after pleading guilty, was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. At his sentencing, he offered no defense. He accepted his fate in stoic silence. His life, a promising success story of a black man who had overcome every obstacle, ended behind bars, haunted by the bitter truth that he had destroyed everything over a lie and an uncontrollable rage. Douglas Pierce resigned from Pinnacle Capital Group the next day. Rumor had it, he sold his house and moved to another city, trying to outrun the shadow of his own betrayal and cowardice. His career was in ashes. Catherine Morris, whose testimony helped break the case, also left Aspen. She would live the rest of her life with the guilt of a friend who lacked the courage to do the right thing from the start. She was a witness, but in her own mind, she was an accomplice in silence. Detective Zora Addison sat in her office, reviewing the final report on the Melina Freeman case. A classic crime of passion, provoked by a cascade of lies and betrayals, each one building on the last until the weight of them all caused a total collapse. She looked out her window. The snow had stopped. The sun was out, melting the ice, revealing the bare ground beneath. She closed the file, another story that began with love, or at least something that looked like it, and ended in tragedy. The blizzard in Aspen that night eventually passed. It had covered the town in a blanket of white, as if trying to hide all the dark secrets, the sins and the sorrow beneath its pristine surface. But there are some stains that even the heaviest snowfall cannot conceal forever. The case of Melina Freeman was not just a crime of passion. It was a tragic testament to how lies, betrayal, and repressed rage can create a destructive whiteout, burying everyone in its path under an avalanche of ice. Lewis Freeman killed his wife in a moment of madness, but he was also a victim of a sophisticated web of deceit. The lesson from that night in Aspen, a lesson written in blood and tears, is as simple as it is profound. The truth, no matter how painful, is always better than a lie, because the price of deception is sometimes not just a broken heart, but a life. And when the truth is buried for too long, it does not sprout into a green tree, but germinates into violence and tragedy.